that out at the other end of the arteries, the blood's running out at out the other ends of the arteries, way out at the end into the capillaries. So you have what's called capillary drain off, which causes your blood pressure to drop back down to 80 in your aorta. So anyway, this is right between from here to here is ventricle systole. The ventricles are contracting. This first part of ventricle systole is isovolumetric contraction. This next part is cardiac ejection. And the cardiac ejection, the slope of the curve is going up when the rate of blood flow into the aorta exceeds the rate of capillary drain off out at the other end. The slope will go up here. When it's level at the top, the rate of flow into the aorta equals the rate of capillary drain off. And then as the ventricle starts to relax, this starts to go down, and capillary drain off exceeds the flow of blood into the aorta. And finally, the pressure in the ventricles drops lower than the pressure in the aorta, and the semilunar valve snaps shut right here. And so once the semilunar valve snaps shut, all four valves are closed again, and you go into isovolumetric relaxation, where the blood pressure drops rapidly in the ventricle, stays up in the aorta, doesn't it? Okay? But drops rapidly in the ventricle, and finally when the pressure in the ventricle drops lower than the pressure in the atria, the mitral valve opens, and all that blood that was coming into the left atrium falls into the left ventricle. So here we see the ventricle volume, and we're not surprised to see that the ventricle volume drops during the cardiac ejection phase, because it's being pumped out into the aorta. But then, when that AV valves, when the semilunar valve snaps shut, okay, there is no change in volume in the ventricle. But then when the AV valve opens, and all that blood from the atrium falls into the ventricle, this is when most of ventricle filling occurs, isn't it? Okay. It's not the atria squeezing blood into the ventricles at all. It's because it's when that AV valve first opens, and all the blood that's been coming back into the atrium while the ventricles were pumping, all that blood is finally allowed to fall into the ventricles. That's when you get ventricle filling. Heart sound 2 is when the semilunar valve snaps shut. So I have quiz questions. You'll have about 5 quiz questions on the cardiac cycle. And during which phase, when does the aortic valve close? And the answer would be at the beginning of isovolumetric relaxation. When does the mitral valve close? And the answer would be at the beginning of isovolumetric contraction. Those are a couple that I've got that I can think of. When does the maximum ventricle filling occur? And that's during, it's not during atrial systole, it's during ventricle diastole that most of it happens. So let's go through this. Before the cycle, the atrial pressure is greater than the ventricle. I've said it all already, but now you can watch it all in writing. Atrial pressure greater than ventricle, mitral valve opens, blood falls from atria into the ventricles, blah, blah, blah. Before the cycle isn't as important as other places. Atrial systole, the SA node fires, the impulse spreads through the atrium depolarizes, and you get the P wave. So you should be able to correlate the EKG with various parts of the cardiac cycle. And the atrium contracts, but that doesn't squeeze much blood into the ventricles because it's already fallen in there. The impulse spreads into the AV conducting system, PR interval completed. Atrial contraction is not required for ventricle filling because they're almost completely filled by this tract. So atrial systole, okay? And that is right here. That's this part here. So, okay? Ventricle systole, this is divided into two parts. Isovolumetric contraction. So when the ventricles start to contract, that's get your QRS complex. The AV valve snaps shut, giving rise to heart sound 1. Both the mitral valve and semilunar valves close, thus the term isovolumetric. The pressure goes up like crazy, okay? Isovolumetric contraction, all the valves close, and all that's going on is the ventricles are squeezing like crazy. And so you see the pressure goes up, and this period doesn't last very long, does it? Because water's an incompressible fluid, and the pressure's going, it doesn't take long for the pressure in the ventricles to get high enough to force the semilunar valve open. And then you get into the cardiac ejection phase. Heart sound 1, QRS complex. So ventricle consistently consists of two parts. Here's the second part, cardiac ejection. This is really the business end of what's going on. Okay, the aortic valve opens, the ventricle goes into isotonic contraction. The ventricle pressure rises at first. Ventricle volume is ejected into the aorta. Does the entire contents of the ventricle ejected into the aorta? Remember, we said that about the maximum cardiac ejection fraction that you ever get is about 85%. It's impossible for the ventricles to completely squeeze it all out. Ventricle repolarizes, starts to relax. Okay. There's the cardiac ejection phase, and blood is being pumped into both major arteries, the pulmonary trunk and the aorta. So that's the cardiac ejection phase there. And finally we get into, we're out of ventricle systole, we're now into ventricle diastole, and there are two phases to that. The first phase is when the semilunar valve snaps shut, giving rise to heart sound 2. Both valves are closed, they're all closed, so that's why we call it isovolumetric relaxation. The volume doesn't change. Pressure drops like crazy. And so there it is. The ventricles have ejected most of their contents. All 4 valves are closed. Okay, pressure's dropping rapidly. Finally, it gets low enough that the mitral valve opens, and all that blood that was in the atrium falls into the ventricle now. So they call this second phase of ventricle diastole ventricle filling, because this is when most of it happens. And I've got a quiz question on that. Ventricle pressure drops below atrial pressure, mitral valve opens, blood falls into the ventricle, a whole bunch of it, okay, as you can see there. Ventricle filling. AV valve opens, and the contents that was running into the atrium falls into the ventricle. So, here it's none of it's labeled. So which part of this is, which part is atrial systole? Is it purple or blue or brown or what? Where's atrial systole on this?
Purple.
No? No?
Isn't it the first?
Well, I guess it must be brown.
Isn't it? Isn't
Well,
it?
you
The,
look for a P wave, and there it is. So the P wave initiates atrial systole, okay? And there we see, this is the volume, this is the pressure in the ventricle. This is the pressure in the aorta. It's kind of different labeling here. And this is the pressure in the ventricle. So the pressure in the aorta never drops below 80. But the pressure in the ventricle is close to 0. And then you get the QRS complex, and we now get into ventricle systole, and the first part of that is called isovolumetric contraction. AV valve snaps shut, giving rise to heart sound 1. The pressure rises rapidly, and when it equals the pressure in the aorta, semilunar valve opens, and you get the second phase of ventricle systole, which is called cardiac ejection. Finally, when the pressure in the ventricle drops below the pressure in the aorta, then the semilunar valve snaps shut, giving rise to heart sound 2, and you get isovolumetric contraction. And I think they should have put heart sound 2 more over here. But anyway, pressure drops rapidly, bicuspid valve opens, and now this is when you get most of ventricle filling, right there. So that's kind of a good exercise to see if you can name those regions, just looking at the evidence that's given there. And there are pictures that show isovolumetric contraction, cardiac ejection, isovolumetric relaxation. They have them ordered differently. These are from different sources. Okay, so we'll finish it off by talking a little bit more about atherosclerosis, since that's where so much of the pathology comes from. But thanks to the wonderful statin drugs, there's no excuse for people our age to have that. Okay, atherosclerosis most often develops in regions of turbulent flow. A bifurcation of a major artery is a place of turbulent flow, like the bifurcation of the common carotid artery. And plaque very often develops. We had one cadaver that you could palpate the carotid artery in that cadaver, and it would just crunch from all the plaque that was in there. Crunch. A real sharp, crispy crunch.
I have a question. How
Yeah.
long would it do that for?
What?
When you would crunch it, how long would it do that for before it eventually became brittle?
We crunched it and crunched it and crunched it, and it always seemed to continue to crunch.
Okay.
It's funny, it was in my mind, I was almost anticipating that question, because I thought, did we ever crunch it out finally? And I think it continued to crunch as often as we crunched it. So that plaque is pretty resilient. Okay, so how does plaque form? Well, the latest theory is that here we have a healthy artery and an endothelium, often called the intima. The endothelium is made up of simple squamous epithelium and a basement membrane and a little bit of a few elastic fibers. But the endothelium is not a real simple structure. Okay. Here we have two different lipoproteins, LDLs and HDLs. This is your bad cholesterol, and that's your good cholesterol. LDLs cause atherosclerotic plaque, no doubt about it. Okay. HDLs actually exert a beneficial effect because they carry cholesterol from the extremities back to the liver. We need LDLs because they carry cholesterol out to cells in the body that need it. You just don't need abnormally high levels of LDLs. Normally LDLs can pass out in and out of the intima, which has little holes in it, okay? Little fenestrations, and LDLs pass, kind of swim in and out, that's all normal and everything. But when your blood levels of LDLs get too high, they get in there and they get caught, and they can't get out. And that's when problems start to develop, because the intima doesn't like that, and starts to mount an immune response against them. This is just showing how females normally have higher HDLs than males. Okay? Females generally have slightly better cholesterol profiles on average, not always. Aerobic exercise enhances HDL levels significantly, okay? Which is, you know, so do the statin drugs. So your endothelium oxidizes these LDLs, which sort of puts an immunological label on them so that our immune system attacks them. So macrophages swim in through the holes and phagocytize the LDLs. And the macrophages eat so many LDLs, they get too full, too stuffed full of them to get back out. And we changed the name to foam cells, which is a macrophage stuffed full of LDLs. And it is the foam cells that comprise, they then become part of the artery, and they comprise the plaque. It's made out of foam cells, stuffed full of LDLs. And they can't get back out. And that's what this says. Okay. And so atherosclerotic plaque is comprised of foam cells. So now you start to see this plaque starts to elaborate, but you can only get so many LDLs in there, okay? It's very seldom that an artery gets completely closed, okay? Typically, the scenario is that it'll get to a certain point and it'll just kind of become dormant, it'll quit. Notice that we've greatly reduced the lumen of this artery though. And it may become occluded all the way around. And very often, you know, when there's something foreign in the body, like a sliver, it's not uncommon for the body to form a cap, a fibrous cap over it, just to sort of protect against it, okay? And this is what happens very often with the plaque, is we form formation of a fibrous cap over the top of it. And it just kind of goes dormant, and LDLs can't get in there anymore, but boy, it's there forever, okay? And for a lot of people, that's the end of it. The blood carrying capacity of that artery is compromised. You have a stenotic artery, but for some people, the artery doesn't like that and starts mounting an inflammatory response. And what you don't want to have happen is for that to have a big inflammatory response in there that ruptures the fibrous cap, because it starts to spew forth thromboplastin. Remember what thromboplastin does? Causes a clot. And this is when you have a perfectly healthy person standing there talking to you who keels over dead from a heart attack. I mean, this person has had this dormant for probably years, and just at some point or other developed a thrombus, and which completely cuts off the artery, and the tissue downstream dies. Okay? If it's a teensy little artery, you never even know it happened. If it's a moderate one, you live through it, but it's not fun. And if it's a great big one, you die right on the spot. Okay? So that's a myocardial infarction. There's your thrombus, and the tissue downstream becomes, look how occluded, stenotic that artery is.
So I've heard the term saddle thrombus. What is that?
I don't know. I've never heard it. I've heard a lot of cardiovascular terms. That's a new one on me. So, don't know. Thus, it is not just LDL levels that are indicative of cardiovascular risk, it's your tendency to develop an inflammatory response. And they've even developed a way to determine that. You guys don't have to know this, but if they really suspect that you're in this situation, they'll test you for C-reactive protein, which seems to be linked with one's inflammatory levels. And they've done tests where if you have high levels of C-reactive protein, you can have high levels of LDL, and this will be your risk factor. You can have high levels of C-reactive protein, and that'll be your risk level. But if you have high levels of both of them, that's your risk factor. And it's not a nice scenario. Okay, and that's it. So, piece of cake.
Bye.